Hello and welcome. My name is Shuvaloy Majumdar, and I'm the Program Director at the Center for Advancing Canada's Interests Abroad at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, the nation's largest think tank in Ottawa. I'm delighted to be joined today with my friend and colleague, Senior Fellow at the Institute, Balkan Devlen. Balkan is our resident expert on everything from the Baltic to Black Seas, the issues of geopolitics and emergency response. He's an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen and a spectacular guy and a great friend. Balkan, welcome to our first ever video briefing.
Thanks, Joe. It's great to be back and talking to you even through video.
Very good. Well, we're all quarantined and making it work. I'm pleased to see that you're comfortably situated and safe and healthy and happy, and I hope your whole family is strong through this.
Thank you. I hope the same is true for yourself.
Okay, well, let's just dive into the subject matter here. We're here to talk about the politics of the coronavirus, the COVID-19 crisis that the whole world is caught up in today. And I've got a lot of questions for you, but let's try and keep this terse so that our audience can get some of the top line views that you have on the key issues that we're all being impacted by. So I'll start with the very first question, Balkan. My question is this. We are in the midst of global crisis today. Economies are shutting down around the world. There is an energy price war underway, and it seems fairly bleak, doesn't it? I was going to ask you, where do we go from here? It seems like right now we're all just focused on the immediate crisis of public health.
Well, we do need to focus on the immediate crisis, partly because until we figure out a way out, that is either through developing some form of vaccine, which is probably in the best case scenario about 9 months ahead or even perhaps more. There is no guarantee that we will have a working vaccine anytime soon, or some effective form of treatment that actually decreases the fatality rates. We need to be able to deal with this, partly because if we don't, not only we will have the economic costs that we are going through right now, but also immense human costs. But we should also start at this point, try to think what the world would look like in 18 months hence.
Right. Well, we have so much to talk about on that. I mean, we could talk a little bit about the economy, but I was kind of curious to see, in the geopolitics of the COVID crisis, there are winners and there are losers. There are people who are at risk, but nation states are in serious competition for control. So I'm curious, from your vantage point, you've made a study of authoritarians. You've looked very closely at how different authoritarians across the regions that you cover very specifically are acting. When we're looking at the Russias and the Chinas and the Turkeys and others, do authoritarians end up coming out ahead of this crisis, or at the end of the day, are they as disadvantaged as the rest of the free world seems to be?
I don't think they will be coming out ahead. I mean, there is a lot of talk about how authoritarian regimes could handle these crises because they don't have to sort of deal with the democratic processes, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that's the wrong way of looking at it for precisely two reasons. One, authoritarian regimes such as Russia and China, as we see, tend to lie and hide and try to suppress information about the actual effects of this pandemic in their countries, as well as because the globalized nature of both the travel and economy, the suppression and lies actually leads to further have consequences for the rest of us too, and countries are aware of that, despite the efforts of China and others trying to sort of change the narrative and use this as a way of dealing with or improving their international status. That's number one. Number two. Success on situations like these pandemics heavily rely on state capacity to maintain social cohesion in times of stress, when you have particularly economic stress and increasing fear among the public. And authoritarian regimes mostly rely on intimidation and oppression and suppression to maintain their control, which will become even more harder in times like this. So no, they are not necessarily going to get out of this ahead. The populist nationalists, the way that they produce these arguments, try to portray it as their way of governing is superior to democratic regimes. But when dust settles down, 12 months to 18 months from now, I believe that the balance sheet would show that authoritarian regimes did not do better. Even now, we saw democratic regimes such as South Korea, Taiwan, Germany, Israel are doing a much better job in controlling and limiting and mitigating consequences of this pandemic. But that doesn't mean that authoritarian regimes will not try to shift the narrative and try to sort of use this as a PR opportunity.
Well, it's been very clear. I mean, give us a bit of a picture, because we've seen coming from China a vast propaganda effort. And, their role in the COVID-19 crisis itself has been deeply consequential. So give us a bit of a picture as to what you see kind of in the short term, because it seems like authoritarians are certainly pulling out all the stops when it comes to their disinformation in Western societies, globally, even beyond the West. They seem to almost have democracies in a bit of disarray, don't you think?
They have I think what they do know is, particularly with regards to China, is that they need to shift the narrative, because in the case of China, one of the primary reasons why this became a global pandemic rather than a localized issue was the corruption and the lying and the oppression of the Chinese regime, and their incompetence in dealing with the initial stages of the pandemic. So they need to shift the whole attention to others. And they need to also show, this is the same case for Russia, for example, that they need to show to their suffering populations that others, for the democratic countries, are actually worse. And thus the public should not complain about. And should not, show, resentment and opposition to the governing regime at home. So primarily, their primary concerns have always been the worry that the democratic regimes can show that they could handle these things better, and thus the authoritarian policies at home are not the best way to deal with it, and therefore they need to engage with these disinformation campaigns to derail the policies that are pursued by democratic regimes in order to limit and control the actions and discontent within their own populations. And of course, you should never waste a good crisis to advance your own regime's interest abroad, and we see that particularly with China and Russia, right, very clearly.
Right. Well, closer to home, it's been a big day today in Canadian media. This is when Minister Patty Haydu, our health minister, when she was being asked by a journalist about facts coming from China, she dismissed outright the idea that China has been lying about the virus, its origins, its own toll in terms of people, and then went on to accuse a Canadian journalist of spreading conspiracy theories. It almost seemed like it was straight out of the Communist Party's playbook. So, what's your take on how information like that is going to impact us as Canadians and how we ascertain the threat and try and develop the best possible fact and evidence-based responses?
I think one of the most important things the policymakers, Canadian policymakers, but also others, should not do is to undermine the public's trust in the government's ability to handle this crisis. Statements such as these actually significantly undermines people's trust in government policies. If one starts wondering if the health minister is not aware of the false numbers and lies coming out of China, to what extent then the same minister is aware of what the actual situation is, or to what extent they are providing accurate and transparent information. Again, what we see in places like Taiwan and Singapore and South Korea was not only sort of very active, widespread testing and other mechanisms of contact tracing, but also very transparent, accurate, and timely information given to the public by the officials, and that relies a lot on the maintaining the trust between the public and the government. And statements like these undermines that trust, undermines the Canadians and the citizens' belief in that their government is doing a competent job when you go ahead and repeat Beijing's speaking points on TV.
Right. Thanks, Balkan. Listen, I've got one final question for you. I know we want to keep this brief, and there's so much to cover, but it strikes me that this entire COVID-19 crisis has set off a wider discussion about the nature of how interconnected we all are. And as we start realizing how these authoritarians make decisions that impact the public health and safety of our families, no Canadian today is untouched by the impact of these authoritarians in their own homes, literally. Does this mean that globalization as we know it is dead? Does it mean that for Canadians, we have to rethink about what our interests are in the world? In your view, in a few short words, as hard as I know that's going to be, what does this mean to Canadians when they think about the concepts of globalization, trade, interconnectedness, and all of those things that the world has become?
I think one line would be is that this crisis shows us that this is still a game of nation states, right? When things are going fine and business as usual, our supply chains work, we could get what we want, and everybody wants to trade. But when times of stress and crisis hit, everybody returns home and try to ensure the well-being and the prosperity and security of their own citizens. This would probably be a wake-up call for not only for Canadians, but for others, that we need to develop redundancies more in crucial sectors, in infrastructure, in building basically sort of buffer zones and elements that we can rely on when the systems don't work. Canada, as a middle power, relies heavily on a stable international system, but over-optimizing and not developing redundancies could very well be fatal. And we are seeing that right now. So I think moving forward, Canadians would also start to develop not over-optimization, not over efficiency on everything, but redundancies, replication of certain things, and bringing onshoring certain industries and capabilities that was sent offshore way before.
Yeah, so it was in the post-war order, like it was in the aftermath of the Second World War, in which institutions were built to shape how our democratic norms, underpinned by the rule of law, were going to help not just democracies coordinate and cooperate with each other, but also how to engage the swath of countries that were young democracies or perhaps under Soviet influence. Would you say that somehow in the last years, ideology has taken over the idea and the concept of the nation state, that there have been leaps and bounds in the direction to a new type of collectivist identitarianism at the global level? I ask this because I don't know if this reset that you just described so eloquently is necessarily a bad thing. I wonder if one of the great opportunities here is that democracies now have the opportunity to reconnect with what makes them so unique and not be confused or relativist about the authoritarians in our midst.
No, I don't think that's actually a negative thing. I think it is a more robust way of thinking and realizing that not everybody shares the same values. Not everybody is willing to support each other in times of crisis, and that we need to rely on more on like-minded states rather than be held hostage to those regimes that are hostile to our own values. And I think this rude awakening, in that sense, has a silver lining in it, and a return to a more limited understanding of who our friends are and what we can expect from other countries is actually a good thing.
Well, Balkan Devlen, I can't think of a finer point to conclude our first conversation in. Thank you for your views. I'm looking forward to your writing and publishing here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And to our audience and viewers, welcome. Thanks for visiting. We'll look forward to doing many more of these with you in the road ahead. I'm Shuvaloy Majumdar for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute.